Chapter 3. Squaw Lake is more than 10 miles in length, but nowhere much over a mile and a half wide. It meanders through the bush like an overgrown river, its shores cut deeply by innumerable bays and coves. On a point nearly halfway down the lake, the two Vanderbecks landed that morning of the 13th of October. Jim led the way up from the water. "If you've never seen it," he told Lindsay, "it's worth a look. We ought to stop and pay our respects anyway. Most of the trappers do when they pass this way." After a while they came to a little cleared space, and in the middle a little mound of earth with a wooden cross set up on one end. Hanging on the cross was a big old nickel-plated watch. "Here's where he's buried," the older brother explained. "An Indian boy. Died here about 12 years ago. He was prouder of that watch than anything he owned, so they hung it on the grave. It's been out here in cold and snow for 12 winters and still runs." He saw disbelief on Lindsay's face and laughed. No, he said. "I don't mean it keeps running all the time, but if you wind it, it'll go." They stepped nearer, careful not to tread on the grave, and Jim wound and set the weather-beaten timepiece. "Now listen," he suggested. Lindsay put his ears close to the watch. Sure enough, he could hear its labored ticking and see the rusted hands begin to move. "Say," he breathed in a tone of awe, "that is some watch. It's a wonder someone never stole it." "Off a grave?" Jim countered. "No Indian would, and the white men are scared he'd haunt 'em." A few miles further on, the boys came to a cove where a little river emptied into the lake. Jim, on the forward canoe, pushed into the mouth of the stream and waited for Lindsay to come alongside. "This is the outlet from Sucker Lake. The camp isn't far, 2 or 3 miles and no carries. Keep on the same channel I do and watch for snags." Paddling cautious in the shoal water, they came out after a while on a fair-sized lake. "Camp's right over there," called Jim. "You can't see it through the trees, but the landing's close to that big rock." They beached the canoes and it came in sight of a small log cabin among the spruces. "Ah," said Lindsay. "I thought you said it was new and weather-tight. Look at that roof." Jim, who had walked up the trail, paused in consternation. "What in thunder?" he exclaimed. "Why, it was new. I nailed that tar paper on myself. Looks as if a tornado struck it." On the side nearest them, more than half the heavy roofing paper was torn away. It hung in long shreds from the eaves, leaving the bare posts exposed. They hurried to the cabin and unlatched the door, but inside nothing appeared to be disturbed. Stove and grub box and table and bed were just as Jim remembered leaving them. Outdoors once more, they made a closer inspection of the wrecked roof. "I know," cried Lindsay. "It was a bear. Look at those claw marks, the old son of a gun." In the bark of a jack pine that stood close to the eave there were deep scratches, and still more deeper ones showed on the stout poles of the roof. "He sure wanted to get in," Jim frowned. "What do you suppose he was after?" "Oh, I remember now. We left a chunk of bacon in that grub box. I thought I smelled something rancid when we were inside. Well, we'll just have to do some sort of patch job, I guess." They cut a good-sized tree and peeled the bark as best they could with their axes, laying the uneven strips and overlaying layers on the poles. To hold them down, they brought stones from the lake. Then they went inside. Jim looked upward and saw large chinks of daylight still shining through. "Well, Lindsay," he laughed, "she'll be tight enough with a foot of snow on top. You'll have to keep an awful small fire, though, or you'll melt your roof." "Yeah," the younger brother growled. "Old Bear would have to do it to one of my camps. All 'cause of your stupid rotten bacon, too." They cleaned out the grub box and deposited a few of the provisions. That was the purpose of this trip, to leave supplies at each of the line camps. The afternoon was well along when they had the place shipshape, and there was no use in going further that night. What do you say we take the shotgun and see if we can get some more of them ducks? Lindsay suggested. They got into one of the canoes and paddled quietly along the shores of Sucker Lake. At each marshy cove they looked hopefully for ducks, but there was neither sound nor sign of them. The boys were just about to turn homeward when they heard the plaintive call of a cow moose ahead. "Come on, let's see if we can see her," Jim whispered. Paddling stealthy, they worked the canoe around the next point. A large cow and her calf were feeding in the marsh grass 200 to 300 yards up the lake. Again the moose lifted her head and sent the sound echoing from shore to shore. Almost at once a deeper bellow answered her, a roaring call that sounded so close the boys jumped. Then, right in front of them, a bare half-dozen canoe lengths from where they sat, a giant black bull came out of the woods. "Boy, oh boy, what a head," whispered Lindsay. The big moose turned at the sound and looked directly at them. His antlers had a magnificent spread, 60 inches, Jim estimated afterward, and he looked 7 or 8 feet tall where he stood at the water's edge. "Let's get out where we can see him better," Jim murmured, and the canoe moved quietly toward the middle of the lake. The cow and calf had winded them now and started leisurely for higher ground. Until they had vanished into the bush, the bull did not move. He was standing guard. At length he gave a scornful snort and wheeled about. He passed into the dark of the trees as silently as he had come. Jim sighed. "Too bad to miss a shot like that," he said. "But he's too fine a head to kill for meat. I sure wish we had had a hunting party along. Still, maybe he'll be here next year." The sun had set behind a bank of cold-looking clouds when they reached the cabin. "Wind's in the southwest," Jim remarked, sniffing the frosty air. "Feels like a change in weather. We'd better get to bed early and make my home camp if we're going to make before a storm gets here." His prophecy proved accurate, for the next morning was bleak and overcast. They shut up the camp and took the 2 canoes down the Outlook Brook to Squaw Lake. As the shores narrowed and the current hurried them into the head of the Squaw River, the first flurries of snow began to drive across the water. "Steady now," yelled Jim. "River's high and those rapids will be fast. Better get your pole handy." In 5 minutes it was snowing heavily, blurring their vision as they bent forward, trying to gauge the current ahead. The first few rapids they shot with the paddle, running down fast through the whitewater. But there were worse places below. Jim saw a treacherous part of the channel leaping nearer through the driving snow, and stood up, balancing the setting pole. Jim behind him followed suit. They had been down the Squaw many times before. Each of its perils were familiar to them. But, veiled by the snow, the landmarks were hard to recognize. Twice Jim's pole slipped on smooth rock before he found the hold he sought. Finally, he was able to check his speed and ease the canoe down, past hungry rocks and swirling eddies. There was smoother water below, and he looked around to see Lindsay, a good canoeman as himself, paddling close aside. The younger boy grinned. "Take any water?" "Only a drop or two. How about you?" "Dry as a bone." The cabin that was to be Jim's home camp for the winter was 7 miles down the river. It took them less than an hour to reach it, thanks to the high water. But when they hauled out on the shore beside the cabin, it was snowing too hard to make further progress that day. They unloaded the canoes and carried the supplies indoors. This camp was much like the others they had visited. A French trapper had built it some years before and sold it to the Vanderbecks. The log cabins enclosed a room about 12 feet square. The stove, in its box of sand, filled one corner, and the pole bed another. There was a table made of puncheon, broad split logs, and a crude chair of hand-hewed wood. The floor was beaten earth. In each side wall there was a small square window, with overlapping panes of glass. "Pretty slick, isn't it?" asked Jim, casting an appreciative eye over the place. "It'll do. At least it's got a roof. But I'm cold. Let's get that stovepipe up." They fitted the rusty pipe into place at the back of the tin stove, and Jim scrambled to the roof to remove the flat rock that covered the hole. A whiskey jack flapped through the spruce boughs overhead and cursed volubly, ruffled dark feathers against the snow. "Some welcome," the boy grinned. "Get out of here, you robber." And he tossed a chip with vindictive aim at the big gray bird. Canada jays, commonly known as whiskey jacks or gorbies, were old enemies of his. They were always to be found around a camp. Bold, saucy, thieving fellows, the clowns of the Northwood. With the stovepipe ready, the boys took their axes and went after a supply of wood. There was plenty of dry jack pine and spruce within short distance of camp, and in 3 minutes they had each felled a tree. Then, shouldering the long butt logs, they returned to the little cleared space behind the cabin. With both axes ringing steadily, there was soon a neat pile of firewood by the door and a cheerful thread of smoke eddying from the chimney. "You stay here," Jim told his brother. "Keep her going and get the place warmed up. I'll start out on some bedding. If I'm going to live here, I'd better get the lay of the land." He set out, whistling, his axe on his shoulder. The force of the storm was lessened by the thick wood, but wind-driven particles of snow sifted down constantly around his head, and in the swaying tops far above there was a sound like a moan and beat of a sea. Ranging through the bush for nearly half a mile, he finally found what he wanted. It was a clump of balsam huddled close together as if for comfort in the blast. He cut a small tree and was starting to drag it back with him when he caught sight of a round ball of gray-brown feathers on a limb just over his head. It was a birch partridge, the silliest and most helpless of all the birds in the Northwood. He could have reached up with a stick as it sat there watching him with a foolish eye. However, the Canadian game laws wisely protected birch partridge. That is, to give an unarmed man lost in the bush some assurance of finding fresh meat. The grey twilight of the storm and the whirling snow would have confused a tenderfoot's sense of direction. But Jim had unconsciously memorized each rock or fallen tree he had passed. Without actually thinking about it, he followed his backtrack unerringly. When he reached the cabin, he trimmed off the soft, springy boughs of fir and carried in a great armful to lay over the pole floor of bed. "You got a couple holes here that need chinking," Lindsay remarked. "Feel that draft?" There was a crack between the logs with where a tiny pile of snow had sifted through. Said Jim. "Seems to me I remember a good patch of moss back there along the river." He went out again and soon returned with enough of the spongy grey stuff to pack the crevices inside and out. Lindsay had started cooking their noon meal, and when it was eaten, they had the prospect of an afternoon indoors. At the back of the cabin there was a big box, built of logs with a sloping tar-papered lid to keep out the rain. In it was a pile of traps, left there by their father after the spring muskrat trapping. The boys carried them inside by armfuls and spent several hours cleaning and sorting them. They were all sizes from number 1 and 1.5 jump traps to big number 4s that would hold a lynx or coyote. Some needed minor repairs, which could be made with the ordinary tools they had with them. A few were damaged beyond fixing. There was still an hour of daylight when the snow stopped falling. Lindsay took a look around outside and reported several inches on the ground and a cold wind blowing. Jim, meanwhile, had taken a little black notebook and a stub of pencil out of his possible sack and was writing in his diary for the past 5 days. They ate an early supper and made everything ready for a quick start in the morning. With winter shutting down, they would have very little time to spare these next few days. The chill of dawn found them already dressed and eating breakfast, while the dry pine crackled merrily in the stove. They left one of the canoes here and loaded the other with tents, bedrolls, traps, and a few provisions to be distributed among Jim's trapline. They paddled slowly down the squaw, stopping at frequent intervals to fix up cubbies along the shore. Most of the cubbies or trap houses had been built a year or more before. They resembled little lean-tos, 2 or 3 feet high, laid up against a tree. A couple of slope sticks nailed or braced to the sides of the tree, supported to a rough shelter of boughs, and under it a notched log was slanted from the ground to the tree trunk. Some of the cubbies had wings built out on either side to keep an animal from reaching the bait except by the way of the trap. It was nearly evening when they reached the head of the long portage. The grey skies was beginning to spit snow once more. Jim chose a number 2 trap to lay beside a cubby he had just finished repairing and straightened up. "How do you want to go?" he asked. "It's a long haul by land, 2 miles in rough footing. By the river it's 6, but we can get through in a few minutes if we get through at all. With this high water, we might make out over all those rocks." Lindsay looked at the portage trail and then back at the rapids. The river ran below like a wild horse, tossing its white mane. "I'll vote for the river," he grinned. "All right," Jim nodded, "but remember, won't be any picnic." They got in, bow and stern, and Jim pushed off. A cautious stroke or two took them into the middle of the strong current. The drive of the water was strong here, and the channel deep, too deep for setting poles. It had to be run with the paddle. They swept down dizzily with white waves lifting above the gunwales. "Rock!" yelled Lindsay, pointing to the left, and Jim swung the bobbing craft out with a quick turn of the wrist. There were calmer waters below and a bend in the river, where they both paddled hard to keep out of the eddies. Then came upon more rapids, each one rougher and swifter than the last. "Only one more to shoot!" Jim cried encouragingly. They were entering the head of a long twisting slant of water, and the roar of it was already in their ears. The canoe leapt like a crazy thing in the tumbling crests. Once they slithered along a black, big rock with only inches to spare. Once they were spun, end for end, in the whirlpool at the bend, but the light craft straightened out in answer to a quick stroke of the paddle. Jim drew a deep breath. They were almost through. At that very instant there was a cry of dismay from Lindsay, and their speed was checked so suddenly that Jim sprawled forward on top of the duffel bags. The canoe tilted far to one side. It was caught squarely across a big log. "Stay where you are," called Jim. He stepped out on the log and grasped the gunwale. But before he could lift the canoe against the weight of the water that was already filling it, his foot slipped from under him. The next second, he was in the icy rapids up to his chest. "I'm all right," he told Lindsay through chattering teeth. "Get ready now. I'm going to pull her off." A powerful heave succeeded in sliding the craft off the log, and he pushed it ahead of him into quieter waters before scrambling ashore. Lindsay landed 50 yards further down and was hauling out the drenched cargo when Jim arrived. Give me an axe, quick!" the older boy shivered. A dead spruce with grey squaw whiskers trailed from its branch stood close to the bank. Jim braced his numb legs and swung his axe with a vicious bite. A dozen such blows and the tree came down. Lindsay had gathered a pile of dry twigs and was nursing the flame of a match. It caught. By the time Jim could get there with an armful of split kindling, there was a fire, and stick by stick they built it into a roaring blaze. "Golly," Jim muttered as he toasted the seat of his breeches. "I sure am grateful to the old chap that invented fire."